be here, and I get this great opportunity to interview Thomas St. James. The essay he wrote, I have it highlighted, stickied right here. I want to tell you again, it's called The Common Sense of Natural Human Rights. Great modern day statement, similar to what Thomas Paine tried to write and didn't write years ago. One of the many things we'll get to in this, but I want to just mention now is this is written for people. You might be able to share it with someone who isn't particularly political, not tuned in, not necessarily aware of how serious our situation is in America. So it could lure in someone, lure is a bad word, it could convince, inform, persuade people who maybe aren't exactly on our side to understand how serious the situation is, but just a beautiful job laying out where we are in America today. So with that, you want to say anything first?
Sure. Thank you very much, Debbie. I appreciate you spending time to interview me on this. And I just want to say up front, in the interest of time, that this essay in its entirety is posted to my website, which anybody can access for free. It's thomasstjames.com. And I encourage all of y'all to go out, take a look at the website, read the essay in its entirety, and share it with your friends and family, and particularly if you have younger people in your life who may not have studied a great deal about the Constitution or U.S. history. I think they'll find it engaging and informative, and I think it'll be a good jump start for a conversation with younger people in your life. So that's all I'll start out with.
It's a reappreciation of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Just love it. Very simple term. So I'll just start with the very first thing. So why did you go to the trouble of writing this really eloquent piece?
Really, three different reasons, Debbie. First of all, I look across the contemporary American landscape, and I think definitely within the last 12 years or so, I see a lot of protests have cropped up, probably more protests that we've had since the late 1960s and early 1970s. And a lot of these protesters, I think, are quite frankly rent-a-mobs, but there are a lot of people who participate out of passion, and they're protesting for their rights, either human rights, natural rights, consumer rights, healthcare rights. They're always throwing that term out, rights. But I think very, very few of these people who engage in these protests think about where do our rights come from. And I wanted to explain where our rights come from, because really there's only one of two different possibilities. Either our rights come from the government, which is made up of men and women, or they come from our Creator, and they come from God, and we're actually born with those rights. And I wanted people to read through this essay who have not thought about that and come to their own conclusion about where their rights come from. So that's the first reason I wrote it. The second reason I wrote it is actually as an educational piece. I was an American history major. I am very passionate about American history. I love the history of this country. I love what the founders did. And I think there's been a lot of disconnect between current day Americans and their history. Matter of fact, they're being educated that their history is bad and that it's evil. When in fact, if they actually study their history, they'll understand that actually the opposite is true, that we were a nation founded on liberty and freedom and justice. And I think they'll really come to appreciate and love this country and our history to a greater degree merely by reading this essay, and especially focusing on what I call the first 10 rights, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, which I go into detail in this essay about. I think that if they read through that, they'll have a greater appreciation for what our founders did and the legacy that they have that continues today. And the last reason I wrote this essay is actually as a call to action. I'm a patriot. There's a lot of patriots across America, but a lot of patriots, probably most American patriots, are what I call passive patriots. And my wife actually created a term called active patriotism. And I love that term that she created. We actually put it on our vision board. Active patriotism is not just loving your country, but loving it enough to get out and to participate in the process to participate in defending your freedoms and defending your rights. And I'll explain later, we have a roadmap that our predecessors have given that will show us the way to help defend those rights.
Love that. You know, Thomas Paine's original Common Sense, one of the most famous things he wrote. He also wrote a series of other things, and one of the other articles he wrote became the words that were so famous, Sunshine Patriots and Summer Soldiers. And just basically that concept of say it backwards. Summer soldiers and sunshine patriots. But the point was he was making, is it just, are you into this battle unless it's, of course, you know, going to be problematic or troublesome to you, and then you don't want to be bothered. And that's kind of what you're talking about. And so that other piece Thomas Paine wrote was something that George Washington loved so much he had it read at Valley Forge. So the second question back to you is, on the Bill of Rights, you really focus in on the first 10 amendments of Bill of Rights. Do you have some like constitutional law background, or what made you, how do you know about that, and how do you know how to talk about it?
Well, unlike one of our former presidents who claimed to be a constitutional scholar, I do not claim to be a constitutional scholar. However, I was fortunate in that when I was attending West Point, we were, at the time, required to take one entire semester of constitutional law. So I've studied it more than most Americans, and I feel very privileged that I had that opportunity. Obviously, the reason that it was a required course for us at the Academy is because we all swear an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And if you're going to swear an oath and prepare to lay down your life for that principle, you better understand what's in the document. But even though I'm not a quote-unquote constitutional scholar, what I want people to understand when they read this essay is that it is not a difficult document. The document does not need 9 men and women in black robes to interpret it for them and tell them what's in it. You can go ahead and read it yourself, and it's pretty straightforward, and I believe that our founders wrote it in a straightforward manner for that very reason, so that the population of America will understand what their rights are and how our government is intended to function.
Love that. And you do hear on the subject of Bill of Rights, you hear people saying, we have a right to free health care, we have a right to free education and free housing and all that. This concept of rights, I love that you focused on that and said a right is not everything you need, not every necessity is a right. I love that. It's very, very important to kind of uplift the American understanding of our rights. So you actually, in the first part of your essay, explain our rights pertain to 6 topics, which are very interesting. I'm going to say what they are, and then you maybe talk about why. But you have professions, speech, diversity, defense, privacy, and property. These are each segments in your essay talking about rights. So why did you choose those specific topics?
I chose those specific topics because I see oppression and a limitation on our rights within each one of those different topics. I think these are all very, very contemporary hot button issues. The right to self-defense. I mean, just look at what happened to Colorado recently. Another point that I'll bring up is diversity. We hear the term diversity thrown around quite a bit. So I wanted to explain that in a greater degree as well. So because these are contemporary issues, and because I think they're being infringed upon, not just by our government, but also by monopolistic corporations, I think they're hot button issues that should be discussed.
Yeah, they were actually very clever as you spelled them all out. I just want to start with a few of them. So you talked, I think we'll have time to talk about each of them. So regarding professions, what are your beliefs regarding rights in our professions? Like, how are people's choices and professions being threatened, and how does that tie into our rights?
Sure, and in the essay you'll see that I go into a lot of depth about how as a Western society we started out in a feudalist system several hundred years ago. Essentially back then we didn't have the ability or the right to choose our profession. It was whatever our parents' profession was. But as we went through the Renaissance, and then we went through the Enlightenment age, and commerce continued to increase, we discovered that there's other ways to make a living. And so the type of system that we have that from our very founding, even before our nation was born, is a free market enterprise system. It is a capitalist system. And in this system, what it allows us is the freedom to choose what our profession is and to attempt to either succeed as best as we can, and we may not succeed, and if we fail, then to pick up another profession and try something else. Unfortunately, and this is especially became highlighted during the pandemic, was we saw unelected bureaucrats who came to the public sphere and without any laws being passed, defined for us what is an essential profession and what is not an essential profession. That is completely unfounded within the Constitution. There is no constitutional founding for a bureaucrat to define what is an essential profession and what is not. And millions of Americans, particularly small businessmen, lost their business because these government bureaucrats infringed upon their rights. But then this is continued now within our current administration, in which they sign executive orders shutting down things like the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline and saying that we can't drill on federal land. And now a lot of good, hardworking, blue-collar jobs are being lost by edict from a centralized administrative force in Washington, D.C. And what we see now is that instead of a free market system, these people who call themselves progressive are actually foisting upon us a modern feudalist system in which they pick the winners and losers. They pick what they define as the right professions or the non-politically correct professions. And this is not progressive, even though they call themselves progressive. This is actually regressive. And it's not founded within our Constitution for them to have these rights.
The way you ended that answer made me remind me of something I meant to say closer to the beginning, which was, I remember, this is a tiny little commentary, but I remember when Barack Obama was elected the first time, all of a sudden there was a flurry of activity in America and many sides, just in many backgrounds, many areas, people saying, does he have the right to do all of these things? There was a flurry of activity diving back into what does the Constitution actually say the government can do? How is he limited? Does he have the right to do this? So it was focused on the Constitution and the Declaration starting when President Obama was elected. It's happening again now. Serious thinkers, lovers of freedom are saying, wait a minute, let's go back and make sure what exactly the government is permitted and not permitted to do under our Constitution, which is one of the great things you do. Many underlying, in many points you make, is the underlying question is, does the government have the right to do this? Okay, let's turn to freedom of speech, which is obviously essential. The First Amendment, people just relish the freedom of speech. Do you actually think our freedom is being threatened, and how?
Absolutely, it's being threatened. It's being threatened a great deal, both by the cancel culture. It's being threatened by this doctrine of political correctness. Political correctness is nothing but speech code and defining what we can and cannot say in the public sphere. And it's mostly being infringed upon by these large monopolistic social media corporations. But let me just get back again to the essential question on our rights. When we are born, unless we're unfortunately born mute, we're born with the ability to speak. It's not a right that the government has given to us. We're born with that ability to say what we want to say and speak how we want to speak. Yes, our parents, if they're good parents, will guide us in what is proper things to say, what is polite and impolite things to say. But once we become an adult, the government is not our parents. They do not have the right to define what we can say and what we cannot say. And it's not just merely what we say and what we utter from our mouth or what we write and we post on Facebook or Instagram. It goes a little bit further than that. Within the First Amendment, which gives us the freedom of speech, it also gives us freedom of religion. And because our founders understood those two things are tied together. Prayer is a form of speech. Well, look at how many places in the public sphere prayer is being infringed upon. You can't pray here, you can't pray there. That is a complete infringement against our First Amendment right. And the last thing I'll say about this is that in actuality, our right to vote is a form of freedom of speech, because what we are doing when we're voting is we are saying, I want this person to be my representative. It is a form of speaking, and we haven't always had a silent ballot. In many cases throughout our history, we've had where you just publicly declare who you support and who you want to represent you. So voting and accurate voting is a freedom of speech, which we've seen infringed upon, certainly in this last election.
I love that point. I hadn't really thought about that until I read your essay, the idea that your vote is a form of your speech. I love that. Okay, so you talked about diversity, which is like the trendiest subject in America. There is diversity, inclusion, all of that stuff. And why are you relating diversity to human rights? What's the story there?
Sure. So diversity, it's an amazing watchword. I work for a very large global corporation. Diversity is something that is drummed into our heads constantly. It is something that we're taught that we must admire, that we must adhere to, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. Here's the problem I have with those who preach this doctrine of diversity or hold themselves up as divas of diversity, as I refer to them in this essay. Those who are the greatest self-proclaimed champions of diversity are the most likely to not want a diversity of opinion. They will tell us, yes, we must have a diversity, but they will also come back and say, a few segments later on the same TV station, well, you cannot think this way. You need to be reprogrammed. And that was actually a phrase that was used on MSNBC not too long ago. These people are hypocrites who claim to champion diversity and yet not allow diversity of thought and opinion to be expressed in the public sphere. They're complete hypocrites. And if you think about it, those on the left who actually express this form of hypocrisy, for them it's okay. It may be blasphemous for those of us who have traditional values. For them it's okay because the vast majority of them also believe in the doctrine of moral relativism. So if they don't have any grounding, any foundation for their foundational beliefs, it's perfectly fine for them to say one thing and then do another, or do another thing and say something else. So their hypocrisy needs to be expected, but it still should be exposed. So that's the first thing I'll say on that. Second thing I'll say on that is, if you truly believe in diversity and you say, this is one of my core values, I absolutely believe in this, and you'll hear that time and time again from people within our own central government, they should be the biggest proponents and advocates of what is our 10th right, the 10th Amendment, which is actually the rights of the states to define their laws and to act as sovereign entities within our representative republic. But you see just the opposite again. You'll see the exact same type of hypocrisy where they will say, oh, yes, I champion diversity, but no, these states out here, they must do what New York is doing. It's this is same concept as well when you hear, again, contemporary politicians in the current administration who really would only like to have a one-party rule within our federal government. What kind of diversity is in one-party rule? None whatsoever. What we're slouching towards is very much a system that is much like China, in which you have a linkage between large monopolistic corporations and the federal government, all united to rule as their own select group of elites, and strip the powers away from the people as much as possible. So that's why I included diversity in this. I think it's an important topic. I think it's something that people need to really think through. And for those people out there, especially young people who may hear this, if you truly believe in diversity, then you need to be an advocate for people that don't think like you do as well. And you need to be an advocate for them to be able to speak their mind as they want to. This diversity of opinion is directly tied to the freedom of speech. So that's why I wanted to include it in this essay.
You know, that thing about robust political debate is a hallmark of Western civilization, which I say often on my shows, my speeches. It is supposed to be what distinguishes us as a country, this ability to have robust debate in colleges, everywhere else. And so this diversity of thought is necessary, and then the freedom to express that thought. I mean, it's really, if you exclude freedom of speech or freedom of thought from diversity, you're limiting people to the kind of diversity that no one chose anyway. I mean, you're to inherent characteristics you didn't choose versus this beauty of Western civilization. This is a shameless plug for our talk later, because I'm beyond this topic. But back to this. Okay, so the next one you had, and I will tell. I'm actually glad you included this one. This is about well, we all know what happened, the Colorado shooting and the right to bear arms. And there are people who say, well, you know, I know the Constitution says that, but is that really a natural right? Because part of what you're talking about is what the founder are trying to say is, you have these rights naturally because you were born. So how could someone have a natural right to own a gun?
Because they have a natural right to defend themselves. That is the simple, quick answer. If you think about it, this is something that is built into us as biologically. Everybody's heard of the fight or flight syndrome, a fight or flight reaction. It is ingrained in us when we are confronted to either fight back and defend ourselves, or to flee. In one of my books, The Elegance of Ruthlessness, I get into a great deal about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how we have not properly implemented it and nested it for our military strategy. And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right there at the very, very bottom is self-preservation. So it is a natural right that we are born with. It is woven into our biology. And in my essay, I kind of linken it to the freedom of speech. Let's use this analogy. This is the analogy that I use. Let's say that somebody accuses you of something. Maybe they say, Debbie, you stole my car. And you want to say, no, I didn't steal your car. You have the right to defend yourself with your speech. Well, now we have a government who has legislation pending which says, no, you can't defend yourself. We're going to actually go and cut out your tongue. We're not going to allow you to even defend your speech when you've been accused of something. Now, that sounds absolutely ludicrous that people would rip out someone's tongue, but that is what they're proposing now in terms of defense. If we are attacked or if we are threatened, we have the right to defend ourselves and the right to use the tools necessary to defend ourselves, which right now is through firearms. It's very, very specific in the Second Amendment, that we have that right as individuals. But let me just bring up two more points on this topic that I think are important. First of all, the anti-gun lobby is truly not anti-gun. That may surprise a lot of people to hear that. They are not anti-gun. The anti-gun lobby. What they are against is private ownership of weapons. They have no problem with a centralized government owning weapons. They only have a problem with you and private citizens owning weapons. One of the main reasons that, let's just face it, our founders did not put the Second Amendment in there for hunting rights. I love occasionally dove hunting, and I love to hunt and eat what I hunt. But that's not why the Second Amendment is in there. It was woven in there as a defense mechanism against an onerous, tyrannical central government. When our founders, in their wisdom, designed the Constitution, they designed it to try and have as much balance of power throughout society. They wrote it so that there's a balance of power between the state governments and the federal governments. That's why the 10th Amendment is there. They wrote it for there to be a balance of power between the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch. They wrote it as so there will be a balance of power even within Congress itself between the House of Representatives and the Senate. They understood that this balance was necessary for a good, free, functioning society. And part of that balance of power that they understood is to have a balance of power between the population and the federal government. And that mechanism between the two is the right to bear arms. Let me just say one last final point on that. And we may get to this more in the end as well, when Great Britain started suppressing our rights, particularly beginning with the Stamp Acts in 1765, and continued to do so throughout the late 1760s into the early 1770s, our founders showed amazing restraint. They were really peacefully protesting, and they didn't do anything to really confront Great Britain until Great Britain attempted to remove their firearms. That's what sparked Lexington and Concord and the shot heard round the world. So I want us to peacefully protest. I'll get into this more later as a tactic. I want us to be as peaceful as we can, but bottom line is that the ability to defend oneself is a natural given right.
I love that point, and I love to make an example of how great this piece is that was, we were talking about that example of if you're told by the government you're accused of something and we're going to cut out your tongue so you can't defend yourself. It was such a good analogy, and your piece that you wrote is full of these great ideas. I mean, there are things you could actually remember to say to someone you're challenging. And the other point about guns I want to say, and then we'll get to the next question, but the thing about guns is, I have made this argument that the Second Amendment is there to protect the balance of power between the people and the government. And people will say, well, they needed that in Cuba. They needed that in other places where guns were taken away because look what happened. But we don't need that. We're America. And I'd love to have you just talk about that a little bit. Why do we still need it in this modern world?
Yeah, well, it's pretty obvious why we need it. I mean, we have a growing oligarchy within our nation, and it's a tyrannical oligarchy that they are in it for themselves. They're in government and in government positions for their own selves. They are not doing it out of selfless service. And let's just cut to the chase here. If our rights actually come from a government, then what you're saying is our rights come from other men and women. But yet, all of us are flawed, and all of us are sinful, and all of us have some element of greed. So, if you're of the mindset that our rights actually come from government, what you're saying is that your rights come from another individual who is just as flawed as you are. Now, that doesn't really make sense, and that actually dilutes your rights if you are saying that they come from another person. So it's essential that we defend ourselves and we continue to defend our rights against the encroaching tyranny that we see around us all the time.
Okay, if we have time at the end, there's a great story out of Australia about that. But I'm going to go on to the next. I want to make sure we cover these great points, these topics that you covered. You talk about the right to privacy and discuss the right to privacy in your essay. And that's one of those ones that's not actually spelled out in the Constitution, but was recognized by the Supreme Court in a case, Griswold versus Connecticut, years ago, the penumbral right. But you actually address this right to privacy, and I'd love to have you just talk about, where that right of privacy comes from. What does it really mean?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, it is a logical right, and I'll give you a great analogy here shortly. But I would say the roots of our right to privacy actually come from the Fourth Amendment, which say the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. So they have certain things at their house that they should be allowed to keep. This actually goes way back to cases in Great Britain, such as Entick versus Carrington and Wilkes versus Wood from the early and mid 1760s. So this was not something that our founders just created out of thin air. It's something that they had really, really thought about. So I'd say part of our right to privacy comes from the Fourth Amendment and from that initial part of that phrase. Another part of it comes from the Ninth Amendment. And without getting too wonky on you here, the Ninth Amendment essentially says, and Madison explains this in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, that we've attempted our best to list as many rights as possible. But it's not a completely exhaustive list. There may be a few things out there which are inherent to the people, and that's essentially what the Ninth Amendment says. And I think that the Ninth Amendment is one of those amendments that also gives us the right to privacy. But let me just explain the logic behind it. I like to journal. My wife likes scrapbooking. They're great hobbies. If you haven't picked them up, I recommend everybody do that. So in my journal, I have my deepest, darkest, and brightest and most wonderful thoughts. A lot of it happens to be actually after reading the Bible, I'll sit and journal. But they're my private thoughts. My wife's scrapbook, and she actually has a paper scrapbook with real paper photographs in it. They're our best, most happiest moments that she's put together in this scrapbook. So they're ours. We own them. But what we have seen happen both after the passing of the Patriot Act, which is a strange name for that act if you think about it now, and if you see what's going on with organizations like Facebook and Instagram, what they are doing is they are taking our deepest ideas, our most personal thoughts and photographs, and they're taking them and they are selling our ideas and photographs and thoughts to other corporations who are then trying to sell us products. But it gets one step further than that. Not only are they taking that information, that very intimate information about us, and selling it for profit, they're giving it to federal government officials. So now we have a situation that's very highly plausible where someone could knock at your door and say, "We don't like your thoughts. We saw your thoughts. We saw what's in your mind. We don't like it. We think your thoughts are politically incorrect. So you know what? We think those thoughts are a threat. We're going to throw you in prison." That is why the right to privacy is so important, and that is why it needs to be defended in this digital, social media-driven age that we now find ourselves in.
Love that. I think this happy person telling us 5 minutes. I want to make sure I get to all the other things. Okay, so you also wrote about the right to property. We could do this all day because there's so much depth in what he wrote. I'll make sure and cover these big topics. You also wrote about in your essay about the right to property. Why did you include that?
If I'll try and keep this as quickly as I can. Again, I'll use an analogy. Let's say I make chairs. You're a cobbler. You make shoes. We don't have money as an actual system, but I'm going to trade my chair for the shoes that you've made. That's what happened in a barter economy before money was invented. Now let's just say, for sake of argument, that a government official says, okay, before you give that chair to Debbie Thomas, we're going to take a leg of the chair, and Debbie, those shoes that you made, before you give those shoes to Thomas, we're going to take the shoestrings. What just happened there was theft. And taxation is a form of theft. I could get into the taxation discussion to a great deal, and again, I encourage everyone to read my essay, but the form of taxation that we have right now is not a fair form of taxation. It's an inequitable form of taxation in which government officials get to essentially choose winners and losers. They get to choose who they think are good people and who they think are bad people and punish them for their success. And what's interesting is those people who believe in an inequitable form of taxation are the first people to go out and say, you need to pay your fair share. Well, that's kind of an odd way to say, use the term fairness when what they're actually enacting is completely unfair. That's all I'll say for that on this point.
Okay, last question. And you talk about these natural rights being threatened. What can average citizens do? Which I agree with you. Our rights being threatened. What can average citizens do? We see lots of bad news out there. Is there any good news? And if so, what is it?
There's great news, and I want everyone to be hopeful and optimistic for the future, and here's why. Number one, the rights that we have, which come from a divine source, have been codified and written down in the most basic form of law, the foundational document of this country in the first 10 amendments, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. The law is on our side, regardless of what a tyrannical government says and tries to do to suppress our rights. We don't need interpretation from 9 black men and women in robes, or maybe it'll be 12 or 13 now, who knows. Yeah. We don't need that. We can read it ourselves and understand what our rights are. So that is great news. It's already been written down for us. Second thing is, we've had injustices in the past in our nation's history. And we have a roadmap of how to peacefully fight against those injustices. I read a great deal about the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. And one thing that I noticed that I found very interesting was that many of the tactics that he used were used by the Sons of Liberty and by the founders of this nation, in which one of the biggest tactics they used was boycott. They used peaceful protests. They became very original in how they protested. The Tea Party in Boston was in 1773 was a form of a peaceful protest. So what I'm asking people to do is to use active patriotism, to get excited about the potential that you have for this nation's future, to be excited about defending your rights, and to band together in modern day new groups of Sons of Liberty or Tea Party groups or whatever you want to call your group, band together in peaceful, organized protest against the infringement of our rights, and also get your states involved. A lot of these infringements of rights are infringements against state sovereignty. So the first step you probably should be taking is knocking on your state legislature's door and tell them, you represent me at the state, our state's rights and our individual rights are being infringed upon, and you work for me. I don't work for you. This is what I want you to do. So get excited about the future. I truly believe, Debbie, that the numbers are on our side, but we just have to be active patriots to continue to enshrine our liberties.
That was Thomas St. James. The essay is called The Common Sense of Natural Human Rights. You can find it at thomasstjames.com. Great essay. You'll love it. Share it with your 25 best friends. Thank you.